Hey everybody, Tactic Angel here, back to talk a little more about World of Warships Legends. I am, of course, playing on the PlayStation 4. Today we'll be here to talk a little bit about the new premium ship, the Tier 6 Royal Navy battleship, HMS Nelson. As usual, I'm going to start with some history, move into analysis, then we'll touch on commanders, stats, and finally finish off with a bit of gameplay. Battles have a strange way of teaching you to do what your opponents did, at least a little, whether you're the victor or the vanquished, because you can see how military theory measures up with military fact. The Battle of Jutland offered the Royal Navy a bloody and expensive lesson in naval combat, even if the engagement left the Kaiserreich Marine in a situation where it was logistically incapable of continuing its war against England, and it far from dethroned the British Empire as Lord of the Seas. Thus, the Admiralty began drawing up plans for a new series of battlecruisers and battleships, called the G3 and N3 programs, respectively. Emphasizing firepower and protection over speed, the N3 battleships were designed to potentially carry armaments as heavy as 10 18-inch guns, which I need not point out would have resulted in a battleship with a more substantial main battery than the Yamato's 9 18.1-inch guns. Politicians, many of whom served some sort of democratic electorate that had no particularly strong interest in sending vast swaths of itself to death, put together the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. The N3 battleships, then under design, would have missed the tonnage by around 15,000 tons, an equivalent to roughly 6 fully loaded Fletcher-class destroyers. Plus, the treaty did not allow for guns larger than 16 inches. Reducing the size of the main battery would eliminate a lot of weight, but creativity would be needed to create the next ship for the Royal Navy's battle line. This included adopting an all-or-nothing armor scheme popularized by, of all navies, the United States. That wasn't enough, so reducing the area where all of the armor would be situated, leaving more nothing, so to speak, led to pushing all of the main guns forward of the superstructure. Then they scaled the ship down quite a bit, and when even that didn't quite work, the British got really creative. Prior to the Washington Naval Treaty, ships were typically measured with normal displacement and maximum displacement, the former being roughly what a ship would be weighing during peacetime operation, and the latter being what a ship would weigh full of fuel and water tanks and with all the provisions required to kick the maximum amount of butt that a ship could possibly kick. Seeing as the British had a global empire to maintain, they argued, successfully, that among other things, the weight of fuel and water should not be included in displacement measurements. This led to the so-called standard displacement, which sounds exceptionally reasonable, even mundane, as long as you never thought about how a ship would never actually sail under those conditions. It physically couldn't. It also was even more clever considering the Nelson-class battleships had water-filled torpedo bulges, which were a significant part of its torpedo defense systems, and even if the game doesn't represent this, also more effective than air-filled torpedo bulges at the time. The resultant class was the Nelson-class battleships, which might have technically weighed about what they should have under the treaty, but which didn't necessarily please everyone who saw it. The two ships of the Nelson class were HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney. Both ships were named after famous admirals of the Royal Navy, Admiral Viscount Horatio Nelson and Baron George Bridges Rodney. They were both laid down on December 28, 1922, with Nelson being completed in September 1925 and launching in August of 1927. Both of which the Rodney did just a few months behind in each case. The unconventional layout of the ships met with some criticism and led to their nicknames, the Nelsol and the Radol, due to their resemblance of a class of oil tankers at the time, all of whose ship names ended in OL. The list of ship-to-ship successes for the Nelson and the Rodney are relatively short, but it is worth pointing out, in particular, the success of HMS Rodney, in both hunting down the Bismarck and then picking her apart with accurate salvos from her 16-inch guns, while sustaining only minimum damage from returning fire. Also, if records are to be believed, the Rodney is the only battleship ever to have hit another battleship with a torpedo, which I'm sure many of you will note the lack of torpedoes for the Nelson in the game. Both ships would provide escorts at various times throughout the war and participate in shore bombardment missions. Most notably, in fact, both ships were present at the Battle of Normandy, providing ship-to-shore support throughout the invasion. After the war, both ships were decommissioned, and unfortunately, by the end of 1949, both had been sold for scrap. I have to say that the Nelson is a ship that I find a lot of fun to play, and even if I'm alone in this, I'll tell you why I like it. The Nelson is a very tough ship, but not because she's exceptionally well armored. Her strength comes from the fact that she's able to weather so much damage. Now, I've seen the ship likened to a piñata, and I'd almost agree with that, particularly if you don't assume that being a piñata is all that bad, even kind of feels like it would be. Yeah, people keep hitting you, but you can hit them back. In boxing, this is known as the rope-a-dope, where you literally let your enemy wear themselves out by trying to hurt you. It was made famous by, who was it? Oh, right, the most famous boxer in world history, Muhammad Ali. In other words, the Nelson is very much a keep calm and carry on kind of ship. You present a good angle to your enemy and let them shoot you with whatever they'd like. This is particularly useful as long as they're not at close range. It'll most likely bounce and do very little damage. Maybe they'll even set you on fire. But you wait until you have taken just a ton of damage, and then you pop your so-called greater heal. Really, it's a god tier heal. People who are not likely to enjoy this ship are people who don't like slower battleships or who like to sail around in boats broadside, whether they need to or not, because sailing broadside in the Nelson is actually going to end pretty quickly and tragically if you want to do that. Also, if you don't really love the idea of taking damage, then I probably wouldn't choose this ship, because I think in probably 90% of the games that I've played, I've taken a lot more damage than I've actually done. But I've also attracted a lot more damage than even that number. And if you play this ship right, you can take everything from most ships that they can give you, and you can still walk away from it, which will leave your teammates free and unmolested to try to damage the enemies that are wasting their time on you. For your commander setup, if you ask me, the best thing the Nelson has going for it is its heal, which is extremely powerful. It's definitely something you want to get the most out of, and for that reason, I would recommend the following three commanders in this order. First, Charles Madden, and this is all about the survivability skills. So, Master Mechanic, first and foremost, is the most important part of this build, but also Firefighter allows you to weather a lot more HE damage and will to rebuild, because a 3% bonus to a large number is an even larger number, and obviously the more legendary ranks that you have here, the better this is even going to be. This is what I use on the ship, and obviously you can see my other choices as well, and which inspirations I prefer for Nelson. After that, I'd actually have to say that John Jellicoe seems like the next best option. His base trait actually is going to increase the amount of hit points that you can regenerate, and fully packed is going to give you an extra heal. The extra range is also nice, but I can't say I care too much for the rest of these choices. Obviously, setting people on fire more is nice, but you already have a ridiculous fire chance as it is. Last but not least, I think Cunningham is probably the weakest of the three battleship choices here, because you're giving up a heal, or two really, in hopes of having better precision and longer range. Now, accuracy never hurt a battleship, but the drop in survivability here is pretty significant, and for the most part, playing this ship at very long ranges is not going to be preferable, because the further away you are, the less likely you are to actually get the right amount of penetration needed to actually citadel anything, which is already hard enough on this ship. So essentially you're reducing the amount of damage that you can take, and also reducing the amount of damage that you can do, at least from my point of view. For stats, we'll be comparing Nelson with its Tier 6 tech tree counterpart, HMS King George V. Where stats are concerned, all of these numbers are modified by the same commander and at the same level of camouflage. I am, of course, using Madden. So, naturally, the first thing we're going to look at is survivability. The Nelson starts out with 59,400 hit points. It has 9 to 406 millimeters of armor, and it has 25% damage reduction from torpedo hits. Now, for the most part, this is a little bit lower in all cases, except for the maximum amount of armor that the Nelson has anywhere on the ship versus the King George V. Now, I will say, one of the most important things about each of these ships is not listed on this screen. For one, the King George V is very nearly impossible to citadel. I believe its citadel is located within the black box of the Walrus aircraft that is on its deck. And as you know, the black box is the most protected part of any airplane, and God only knows how you citadel it when it's flying around. The Nelson is actually really easy to citadel if you present a broadside to your enemy. This can be anything from a very close range American destroyer to a medium range cruiser and pretty much a battleship at any range as long as you're flat broadside. That said, the other thing you don't see on this is the heal. The Nelson has an absurd heal. Here you can see what I have. I'm healing very nearly 1,300 points of damage per second. This is compared to a little bit more than 300 damage per second on the KGV. Now, in terms of the total effectiveness of the heal, this means that the Nelson heals 25,880 with my commander setup 3 times in a game. My King George V would get 4 heals, however, it would only heal 9,212. So in total, you can look at the Nelson, which can heal more than 76,000 damage in one game, and you can look at the King George V, which can heal a little bit less than 40,000 damage. And that goes a long way to helping the Nelson survive a lot of really ridiculous gun battles and ignoring basically tons of HE damage. It has never felt so good to be shot by an Atlanta as when you're in a Nelson. For artillery, the Nelson has 3 turrets with 3 406mm guns. They range out to 16 kilometers. They reload every 29.5 seconds, and they have a whopping 46% chance of fire. Now, this is one reason why I probably wouldn't fault somebody, particularly someone relatively new, for shooting nothing but HE out of this ship, because the King George V actually has a 5% less fire chance. It does reload quicker, around 5 seconds quicker, but they have similar range and they have the same turret rotation. So all in all, I would say, if it weren't for the fact that all of the guns on the Nelson are on the front of it, I'd say they're fairly even. The Nelson does get a lower artillery rating here, but I personally disagree with this just because it's so easy to get your entire battery into play with the Nelson, and it really does put you in the perfect position to bounce shots at medium and long range. In terms of the secondary battery, the Nelson does have a marginally better secondary battery with a mix of 6x1 120mm guns and 6x2 152mm guns, which you see firing in the same sort of super firing position as the front turrets, just located on the back of the ship. In terms of AA, I'm not really sure how they figure this rating. I would honestly take the Nelson's damage per second based on each of the ratings, but technically the King George V has a higher anti-aircraft rating. Honestly, this doesn't matter, so who cares? Where maneuverability is concerned, the 25.7 knots that you see here is modified by the flag that I am using, so it's a little bit slower than that normally. 750 meters for a turning circle is actually a little bit tighter than the 790 meters you would need in a King George V, and the 14.9 second rudder shift is just barely quicker than what you'll get on the King George V. And then finally we come to concealment. Both of these ships have relatively similar stats. The Nelson is ever so slightly more visible at around 200 meters extra maximum visibility, and where the main battery is concerned, its main battery is so big that it basically doesn't benefit from smoke at all if it continues to fire. Alright, so let's jump into a battle already. We are going to be on Haven. Naturally, I'm going to be in the Nelson. It's going to take a few moments for me to get into position, and while I do that, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing, but I'll also talk a little bit about my choices here. Now, you will notice as I'm playing this game that it takes about a minute for me to put out any particular fire. At this point, I am testing whether or not I like the engine mod on this ship, and I have to say, it's not the worst choice that I've played with. It does allow you to speed up and slow down a little bit faster. Obviously, that's what it's for. But honestly, I prefer the damage control module instead. That allows me to pretty much ignore the fires that I get on my bow and occasionally on my stern as well. And then I just have the one big fire that's going constantly on the center of my ship. It feels a little bit better. I'm not sure why, but it does. I probably wouldn't take, rudder shift just because it doesn't really get you much. And for the most part, I don't think you want to play this ship at close range. I try to play it mostly at medium range, so something like 8 to 12 kilometers, something where I'm not going to take a lot of steep plunging fire, but I'm also not going to be, so close that people start aiming into my cheeks really effectively. So what I'm doing here, I'm moving up towards this island, and I realize that I've got a pretty good head of steam on me, and that's largely because I very intentionally plan on slamming into that island if necessary, and it looks like it's going to be necessary. That I do that because the Nelson is not super good at slowing down. I'm not sure why, but no matter what you do in this ship, it feels like it kind of wants to drift. So in this case, I've slammed myself into this island because I'm at a pretty decent angle where I can engage 2, if not all 3 of my turrets. I'm presenting an angle that's not exploitable by my enemies. And as you can see here, we do have one fire on the ship. It's too bad. It's right on the nose of the ship, and it's going to take 43 seconds to get rid of. That sucks. So here we are. We're shooting out at that Pensacola. I like to switch back and forth between HE and AP in this. I find I usually do better if I do that, but keep in mind, you will get a lot of disappointment out of this sort of setup, just because your dispersion isn't so well controlled that you're getting tight shots in there. So whatever. We still managed to finish off that Pensacola, leaving just the Aoba over there. I'm looking at him. He's like 11 kilometers away from me, so I feel pretty okay about my life. I do pop that first heal. So here you see we're getting a brand new boat practically, and that feels really good. Just the amount of heal that you can get out of that is one of the key strengths, and why I think you really do need to go into this with the survivability build. I know I use survivability all the time. Here I see a disappointing thing happen to me. I expected those torpedoes to run out because of how far away he was. Apparently I misjudged. Such is life. Now we're putting some shells out on that Gneisenau. I honestly don't expect a Citadel of Gneisenau under any set of circumstances with this ship. So what I'm going to do is switch over to HE. German battleships are extremely susceptible to HE damage. They also burn quite nicely, unfortunately. So we're going to go ahead and start to ruin his life. We get a really nice set of shells there. We land pretty much all of them. We got some extra fires going on there. We're doing all right. And you may be paying attention to the HP yo-yo that I'm playing here. We're down to 15,000 again. We're on fire. But honestly, I'm not all that worried about it at this point because I have my heal up again. I'm just waiting for the point where I see both sides of that green bar going down at the same rate. And once I see that, I'm engaging that heal again. We're going to get above 50%, probably up to 60% or so. So, I mean, this is what I'm talking about in terms of what's the Nelson's key strength. I'm over here. I'm taking up the time of several ships. Now, I do have other people over here with me, but I'm taking a good number of shots. I run into somebody backwards. That's actually a fairly exotic way for me to run into people, considering. But he does help me to slow down, so we're going to start moving forward again. We're considering who we want to shoot at. I'm presenting about a 50-degree angle against that KGV. I expect that he's either going to bounce AP off of me or he's going to shoot HE. Still, I'd prefer to shoot at this kind of angle. And this is the angle that I'm talking about. It's the minimum angle that you get in order to get all three of your guns to work. And for the most part, if you're at medium range, you're going to bounce shots. Now, when you start to get into close range, you're going to get some people who can actually hit you right in the cheek. This doesn't work quite as well against Tier 7 ships because some of those ships have enough penetration to get right through your bow. In that case, like if you're going up against an Iowa and you're under 10K, I would just go nose on to them and hope they hit you right in the front of the bow. The distance from the front of your bow to the citadel is great enough that some of those shells are going to explode without exploding in your citadel, which it doesn't sound great, but it's better than if they exploded in your citadel. And you can save yourself a little bit of damage there. Obviously, you can see the nose of this ship is quite long. Now I'm presenting a really, really terrible angle to that King George V. If he were to actually hit me with AP, if I came around this at this angle, he would just do terrible things to me. I'm going to start to try to fix that angle by the time he can see me. I would have beat him on the reload just because of when we both started. I don't quite get around, and that's what I'm talking about in terms of giving yourself up. Thankfully, I don't really take any citadels. He just gets a bunch of penetrations rather than an actual bounce. So that kind of screws up my game a little more. The torpedo hit and that are two significant mistakes in this game. But you can imagine if I don't make those sorts of mistakes and I just take healable damage, I could have gotten a lot more out of that third heal than I did. Now moving up on this final ship on the enemy team, we can still screw this up. Obviously, we have a King George V that's in the backfield, and this New Mexico does present a pretty significant threat to him, if only for the fact that it is on full hit points, at least up until the time that he starts taking damage right there. Now, he is a very brave person, so we're going to start shooting some HE at him. I am switching over to AP. I found, actually, that for the most part, you don't get a lot of really good hits, unless it's on maybe French battleships, shooting other battleships with AP. So kind of obey cruiser rules in terms of when to shoot HE and when to shoot AP in this ship. You know, in this sort of case, it could happen. I mean, it doesn't. We get a Confederate. That's okay. We're going back over to HE. He's going to be behind that island, and he's probably going to have to turn away from me. So, aside from not getting another good broadside shot like that, the HE is probably just overall more effective. Those two continue to battle down there. He's only at half life, so we're going to try to sneak some more shots over here. Get a couple of hits in on the superstructure. Not a terribly aimed shot, considering I didn't really have a lot to work with there. But it doesn't look like that King George is going to make it as he blows up. That looks good. So now he's at maybe a 45-degree angle. We're just waiting a second or two to make sure if he had burnt his damage con, maybe that the damage con, like, time of invulnerability would have run down. It didn't. Or I just got unlucky. In any case, he's not on fire. I guarantee you that's a thing that's going to change if he gives me long enough to actually, shoot him several times. I take a couple of unlucky hits through the bow. No citadels, though. So that's pretty okay. I'm distributing my shots here, trying to get shots into his bow, into the center section of his ship. He's got multiple fires going now. And rather than trying to get my third turret into the action, I'm just going to go bow on to him. I've got 25 millimeters. I have a decent chance of bouncing some shells because the lower part of the front plate, I think, is a little bit more thoroughly armored. And I just watched this guy burn to death. Because I'm a humanitarian, I tell you. Alright, so we managed to finish off with a dreadnought. You get a lot of those in this ship because that heal is just so powerful. Overall, I really do enjoy this. You do have to play it a little bit more carefully when you're playing against higher tiers. One problem I found in the Nelson is that if your first plan doesn't work, you often don't have a really good recourse for a second plan because turning around can be so dangerous. And running away, obviously with all three guns on the front of the ship, doesn't always work. And it seems kind of hit or miss if you get citadeled through the back of the ship. The area from the back of the ship into the citadel is actually quite a bit shorter than from the front of the ship into the citadel. So some funky stuff can happen back there. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this little replay, this review. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll see you guys on the next one.